Good. Hi, Matthew. Welcome. Thank you so much for your time and thanks jumping onto the call.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Matthew, I saw you're an actor.
I am.
How did you jump into acting or how did you jump into Agile? Sort of maybe both answers.
Well, they were related in a way, but not completely. So I got into acting. I had been interested in film. I worked on a film, and I felt like I was interested in directing, actually. But then I thought, well, if I'm going to direct actors, I should know how to act. So I took some acting classes, and then I fell in love with acting. So I did that. That was sort of what I was working on. But I also during the day I'd always since I was younger tinkered with computers, and so that was sort of my day job. I was doing some development that led into business analysis, which led to project management, and then I moved to this company where they were looking for an Agile project manager. I'd heard of Agile and I was sort of interested in it, so I came. They were happy. I was happy that they took me, even though I didn't have any experience in it. And then I learned an enormous amount over the last 6+ years now since I've been here. But so I started as an Agile project manager, and eventually that transitioned to being a full-time Agile coach.
Okay. You know what you did in acting? Has that any way or form helped you as an Agile coach?
Yeah, actually, I think it really has. People here will attest to the fact that I frequently bring up acting examples when I'm working on in Agile as an Agile coach. One of a good example of that is when in my acting training. One of the things that they talked about is they said, look, in a scene, you are doing one thing. Mm-hmm. You have one objective that you're trying to go to. Mm-hmm. You might have a lot of other ideas. There might be other information that comes and things that might change what you're doing or how you're doing it. Right. But there's one objective that you're heading towards. And it, we talked about it in more length, but it really sort of focused on the idea that as humans, like we're good at focusing on one thing, not two, not 17, but one thing. Mm-hmm. And that to me, a lot of the wisdom of the Agile Manifesto, even though it's funny, they don't explicitly state it this way, but you can see it hidden in some of the principles, and it sort of lives, and certainly Scrum specifically calls it out, this idea of focus. Mm-hmm. That is really important, right? This idea that we're going to pick something, we're going to focus on that, we're going to drive toward it. And what's really interesting, I think, a parallel between sort of acting and Agile is, let's say with Scrum, that you set a sprint goal, and then you have a bunch of stories. You say, well, our sprint goal is to achieve this thing, but we think at the beginning we think that's going to involve these stories. And then as you get going and you realize that's going to be too expensive, or we have this problem, or whatever it is, or we changed our minds, whatever, you can still drive towards that sprint goal, even though the details have changed. Mm. And this is really similar to in acting, this idea that in a scene, if it's a scene between a husband and a wife, for example, and the scene is I'm trying to convince my wife to do something, right? To go in, I'm convince her that we need to really invest all of our money in this crazy company that I have, right? Yeah. When I start that, if I start the scene and I think that's all I care about is getting her to agree, mm-hmm. right? If in the first thing she says, sure, that's fine, I'm not going to keep trying to convince her, right? Yeah. I'm going to adjust my approach. Yeah. And similarly, if in the first thing she says, there is no way we're doing that, yeah. I'm going to adjust differently, right? And so it's this idea in both cases where you're A, you're focusing on a single thing, but B, you're ensuring that you allow yourself that you have a clear goal, but you allow yourself the latitude to change in response to the realities of the world.
Right. Yeah, that must be fun. So, coming back to like the Scrum Master itself, that role itself, you are now like an agile coach. So do you manage more than, or do you coach more than one teams?
Yeah. So actually, I'm the only agile coach
Okay.
for the company, and it depends on how you count, but somewhere from 10 to 12, maybe 15 teams. I've stopped trying to count. It's too complicated. Okay. But there are a lot of different teams. So historically, we had wanted this idea that every team has a Scrum Master. And we actually did used to have that. But that Scrum Master played more of a project manager role than what I would call a true Scrum Master. But they were sort of they were project manager, but they also had to do sort of Scrum Mastery type things. Well, there are a bunch of company changes I won't bore you with, but there was a point when we said, we don't have enough people to have a coach on every one or two teams. Even though, like, the ideal Scrum Master seems to be, you have a Scrum Master who's full-time and they're just focused on one or two teams. That seems to be, like, the ideal out there. But we don't have that many people. And so we came upon this hybrid approach, which we're still using. It's been a few years now, where there is one team member who acts as the Scrum Master, but they only do a subset of the Scrum Master roles as described in the Scrum Guide. And our basic rule of thumb was, if it's something where they're going to be there anyway, then they do it. If it's something where they would have to do extra time outside of their current role, a significant amount of extra time, then they're not going to do that. We're going to leave that to the Agile coach.
Like, what's an example of that?
Sure. So an example is, one of the things the Scrum Guide describes is that they have a responsibility to the product team to facilitate meetings as needed. Mm-hmm. Well, they're already at those meetings. So facilitating the meetings, it does require some extra work, but it's not a crazy extra amount of work. Right. On the other hand, you have things like they have a responsibility to the product owner to advise them how to plan in an empirical environment. And that would require them doing a whole bunch of other stuff outside, gaining extra expertise, meeting with the product owner. So what we did was divide the responsibility between the Agile coaches. There were more than one at the time, between the Agile coaches and the Scrum Masters. The second part we did, in addition to dividing the responsibilities like that, is that we said that every Scrum Master will have a one-on-one mentoring relationship with one Agile coach, so that over time they would have the support that they need. Now, we've changed that a little bit now, since I'm the only Agile coach now. We changed that where we have a Scrum Master guild. So the Scrum Masters all meet once a week for half an hour, and the focus is more on them learning from each other as opposed to them learning from me. Mm-hmm. But I also offer to Scrum Masters the one-on-one option if they want. And a typical pattern will be that a new Scrum Master will meet with me 4 or 5 times. They'll kind of feel like they get most of their big questions answered. And then the rest of it they handle through either the Scrum Master Guild, or they just come find me for a one-off meeting or something like that.
Do you think half an hour is enough?
It's interesting. It's it's kind of like I think of it as a good rule if you want people to think you're a really good cook. Always have just barely enough on the table so that everyone eats and they leave thinking, boy, I wish I had more.
I like it.
If you put a big pot of stew in front of them and they can have they will, and then they'll leave and they'll be like, yeah, it was okay. So I think, it's I joke a little bit, but there is something to it. Every single meeting, it always feels like we leave before we're done. Right. But it also means that they're engaged meetings, right? Okay. And we talk, and it never feels old. So, right. So I think it's just on the border of being enough.
Tactically, how does it work? Like, let's say you have a team and the developer plays, let's say, the facilitation piece of it. Mm-hmm. And so does the Agile coach go to the stand-ups, or do you go to the stand-ups? How does it work on the ground?
So we used to, if you read anything about our company history, you know that we went through some really big layoffs a couple of years ago, and before the layoffs, there were 6 Agile coaches, I think. So we had much more time to dedicate to given teams. Okay. I don't now. So I will go to Scrums, but it's more on a request basis. Okay. Someone says, "Hey, we're having this trouble. We want to look at this," and I would go, or I want to just go and check in. It's a relatively rare occurrence. Okay. Usually, I am very big on the idea that if there's a problem, they will come to me, and I make sure they know I'm available. Right. But I really want them, if anything, I want them to feel like I'm leaving them alone instead of feeling like I'm watching over them. Right. So yeah, that's sort of the way it works out. Is it tends to be more like I'll check in with them and I'll say, hey, how's it going? And it might be when we run into each other in the kitchen by the coffee machine. And I'll say, oh, hey, how's it going? I remember you had that thing a few months ago, right? And I'll ask them, and they'll say, oh, yeah, it's going great. Or they'll say, actually, there's still a problem with that. I'm like, oh, really? Want to talk about it? Oh, yeah, sure. Okay, we'll talk about it. It might be something like that.
So on your teams now, who typically plays sort of the role of the Scrum Master? Are these developers? Are these like analysts? Are these QA folks? I mean, what?
So our teams, I would say, I don't have a percentage, but I would say it's a split between engineers and test engineers. We here instead of QA, our department is called test engineering. Okay. So it's either engineers or test engineers. Okay. I think so. The one thing we do stay away from is we don't want the PO to be the Scrum Master also. Oh, okay. That's something we discourage because we just find it's too hard for one person to do it right. They end up just with conflicting interests. But other than that, we leave it open. We don't have a big enough design team or documentation team. Mm-hmm. Those are the other people that are typically on these teams. We also have research and analytics. But those folks, there tend to be so few people that they're not around on a team long enough to be the Scrum Master. So it's usually engineers or test engineers.
Oh, and this is working. This scheme is working well.
Yeah, I've been really happy with it. And when we first started thinking about it, we floated it by a coach who was outside. We happened to be meeting for something else, and he said, I've never heard of anyone doing it, but it makes sense, and I think it's worth a go. It's worked really well in my eyes for a few reasons. One thing that we noticed right away, before we had this system, when we just tried out the idea of a team member Scrum Master, it was a team that I was on, and I had been the Scrum Master. Okay. And I noticed this thing where it seemed to me like I was pushing everyone to do all this stuff that they didn't want to do. And I said, I'm trying to do it. It's for their own good. So it's coming from a good place, but it just doesn't seem to be taking. Mm-hmm. And so I said, we talked about this idea of team member Scrum Masters. Let's give it a shot. So we had someone, and I stood back, and I just would watch. Mm-hmm. And within the first week, I started seeing this engagement and this level of like people doing stuff and like just jumping in. And I think the fact that I was a Scrum Master, but I was a member of the project management department, even though, right? I think there was something about that was like, oh, he's management, he's telling us to do this. Right. It was less about me helping the team and more about them feeling like I was watching over them. So that really tied to this idea of truly giving them a sense of autonomy. So in the Agile Manifesto, one of the principles is this idea of building a team around motivated individuals, giving them the support environment they need. You get out of their way, right? Mm-hmm. The problem is that if you're the Scrum Master on the team and you're part of the project management department and part of your job is to report to the executives and they know that, it's really hard, no matter how many times you say, no, really trust me, it's up to you guys, it's really hard for them to believe that. So that was one really big change that I think happened. And then once we moved to this idea where we had the pairings with the Agile coach and we had more clarity about what the Scrum Masters were supposed to do, I think what it did is it allowed us to get the benefits of that sort of autonomous working on the team without the drawbacks. One of the first drawbacks we saw was that Scrum Masters you have 15 different teams, you have 15 different Scrum Masters. Yeah. All of them they didn't know what the role was, they weren't formally trained, it was all over the place, right? So we did said, let's trim this down to the minimum stuff that they need to do. We can get them trained up on that quickly. Some people take it further, right? We have some folks who are really, really excellent, Scrum Masters who could go out there and do the whole role as a full-time job, in my opinion. And other people who they already have a job, but they're doing the part that, they're doing the minimum part on the Scrum Master. They're doing that great, Yeah. So that model allows, I think, for it allows for that full range. So I've been really happy with it. The other thing that it allows is through the Scrum Master Guild and any one-on-one meetings I have, it allows me to have a really lightweight way of keeping in touch with the teams, right? Because I have a conversation with someone I know. Like if they say like, oh yeah, if in the Scrum Master Guild meeting I say, is there anything anyone wants to talk about? And someone says, our backlog grooming meetings are so boring. Okay, great. Well, I already know something about that team. I know about their backlog grooming meetings, and it didn't cost me more than just being at that meeting, and hearing that one thing. So it's a great channel for me.
Do you think this is a good model going forward in terms of, and by the way, through the research that I have done, there is now, I think, a sizable majority who are thinking like this. Initially, when I started, I just started this with an open mind to say, let's figure out what people are saying and what people are actually doing.
Yeah.
And there is a sizable majority who thinks like this or thinks this is the way forward. Do you think this is really the way forward in terms of the future?
It's hard for me to comment beyond my own situation. But I can say a couple of things that I think suggest to me that I can tell a couple of things that tell me why I'm not surprised by what you just told me, right? Yeah. So the first is that when I ask other people from other organizations what the Scrum Master does or what, the answers are all over the place. So it seems pretty clear to me that the ideal of a full-time Scrum Master who is matched to one or two teams, that is not a standard. So that's the first thing. Even in the cases where that is a reality, what they do and the way that they focus on teams, that isn't very standard. That seems to be all over the place. And my sense is that a lot of places simply don't have that many people around. So you end up with teams that just don't have Scrum Masters. And so the reason that this really appeals to me and the reason that, we originally came up with it here is that it is something that is economically feasible, right? It doesn't require you to hire so many people.
Yeah.
At the same time, it doesn't sacrifice the Scrum Master role because you're still talking about what's important about the Scrum Master role.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it doesn't say to the person who already has a job, like, oh, hey, by the way, now you have to do this other role on top of your own job and have them split all over the place. It sort of works really well in those ways. The other thing that, for me, speaks volumes is when we first made the switch to being 100% Agile coaches as opposed to sort of a hybrid project manager, we were dedicated to one or two teams.
Okay.
We actually, at the very, very beginning, a lot of us limited ourselves to one team so that we could really learn the practice.
Right.
We trained, Lisa Adkins and came in and trained us, and it was really great. And we learned all sorts of stuff. We consulted with other people. We read books and all that. And what we found very quickly was that we would be on these teams and we would know lots of things that we thought could help. We would try all different tactics for making it happen. But what we found was that the teams, once they'd achieved a certain level of performance, they didn't really want the help. Right. They weren't asking for it. And it didn't mean they didn't need it, right? There were things where they definitely could get better. But us sitting around and continuing to push and push and push just wasn't really that valuable. Yeah. And so it strikes me that it's more, in our situation, it was more valuable for the you still have the team member Scrum Masters who are taking care of the basics, but at the higher level Agile coaches, it's better for them to be focused on wider organizational patterns that are going on. Like, what are some things we can do to get the rest of the organization tweaked? So that's why this kind of model, that's why it makes sense to me, and it's also why I could see it potentially being valuable in other organizations in the future.
Yeah, one of the things I have found is, as people who know the domain, and I just spoke to someone yesterday, I think, who know the domain, who know either the product well, they have a better they're better tuned to actually to removing the impediments. I mean, they understand sort of the nuances of what that is. And I just spoke to like an Agile coach. He was like a director at the federal government agency where they were trying to do Agile, and that was his take. He says that the Scrum Master needs to know how to code if he's managing a development team.
Right.
And that was so interesting coming from someone in the federal government and, and how they did. But, anyway, he transitioned out of it. But that was his sort of line of thinking. It was so true.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one thing that I tell Scrum Masters, when I'm recruiting Scrum Masters on the teams, because it used to be people would be like, oh, I have to be the Scrum Master. I don't want to be the Scrum Master. Yeah. And the first thing that I would say to them is, first we have to get rid of a bunch of your conceptions about what Scrum Master is, because some people think Scrum Master is the team admin that just gets the stickies. That's what it is. They have to schedule the meeting and they have to get the stickies. That's what it is, right? I'm like, no. That the team can handle that, right? The Scrum Master does something much more interesting, and part of the pitch for me is explaining to people that if you have 15 different Scrum Masters, you have 15 different ways of being a Scrum Master, right? Because each person is going to bring their own strengths to it. And there is a huge range in terms of the kinds of things that a Scrum Master can do to benefit a team. A huge range of specialties. So it could be, as you just described, that they have a technical mastery. And this is a concept that Lisa Atkins, I mentioned earlier, and Michael Spade, he was also the teacher there, they talked about in this Agile coaching framework, the competency framework, where they talk about the idea of different particular possible areas of expertise within the world of Agile coaching.
Yeah.
And so each Scrum Master, someone might bring, I have coding background, so I'm really going to be good at the technical stuff. And someone else might bring in, I'm really good at conflict navigation. Yeah. So it's okay, good. And so what I tell people is, what do you want to do in the future? Okay. And, you figure out what your career path is. And I can bet you that some of the skills that you need for that future career path, you can build as a Scrum Master. Mm-hmm. So what you can do is use your time as a Scrum Master to work on those skills. Okay. And then I say, you tell me what it is. If it's technical stuff, then I'll tell you the right people to go to. If it's conflict navigation, we can talk about that, And we work on that together as a way to develop so it's a professional development opportunity as well as a chance for them to help the team in the way that is most natural to them.
But career path is such a good example of where there's so much fuzziness around what's the career path for a Scrum Master. And that is so muddied in terms of, where, if you think about just a dedicated Scrum Master, just Scrum Master role, where do they go next? It's so fuzzy. And after speaking to so many people, and the typical answer is, I want to be a coach. And that's the immediate next sort of level that people are thinking about. So that's really hard. Did you face that when you all had Scrum Masters for each of the teams?
I'm sorry. So the career path is hard. And what was the last part of the question about the team?
When you guys did have Scrum Masters for each of the teams?
Yeah.
Did you all face that challenge of where
Well, it's actually interesting. It was actually easier at the very beginning when I joined the company. They had moved to Agile a couple of years before I arrived, and there was a project management department, and within that you could be one of three roles. You could be a Scrum Master,
Okay.
you could be a product owner, or you could be what we call the senior project manager. And the senior project manager tended to be kind of like a program manager, a little bit more traditional, did a lot more of like tracking and budgets and all that stuff. But they also supervised and trained the more junior folks.
Right.
And there was this sort of de facto career path, which was you would be a Scrum Master, then you would be a product owner, and then you would be a senior. It was sort of this, it wasn't always that way, but there was kind of that sense. So in a way, that was a little clearer. Then we got rid of, the product owner role moved into the product management department. The Scrum Master role kind of merged with project managers, and then we eventually kind of just got rid of it altogether. It just became we were Agile coaches, so I definitely have faced some of that difficulty myself. There were times when, as I mentioned earlier, you can look at the history of the company. There was a difficult time a few years ago, a couple of years ago, that we went through with layoffs and all that. And I was thinking about looking around, and I did find myself I do think that the career path for Scrum Masters is difficult. Mm-hmm. So I think that you can use it as something. So, for example, the team member Scrum Masters we have now, right? We say to them, these are folks who are engineers or test engineers, and they don't want to be a career Scrum Master, but it's a great opportunity for them to expand. If they want to be a team lead, if they someday want to be a CTO, it's great for them to know some of the Scrum Master skills, right? So it helps them. But if you're just a Scrum Master, you're purely a Scrum Master, there's a little bit bigger question. Where do you go? It seems like there are couple of places, that at an early level you're going to be a Scrum Master in an Agile program at some company, and you're going to be bouncing around you're going to be on various teams, and maybe you do that at a couple different companies, and then you're going to be maybe a more senior. You could become more senior in that department. Maybe you become a director of an Agile coaching department, a director of a Scrum Master department. But there is definitely a question of where you go beyond that. And I think there tend to be two main paths, right? One is that you go be an Agile coach at a company where they have pure full-time online in-house Agile coaches. Yeah. They used to be more rare. I mean, I know that Spotify was doing it 5 years ago, I think. That's part of what inspired us to get into it. And we're doing it now, but there's only one of me, right? So it's not a huge practice.
Yeah.
And there are some other companies I know. There's a company called Envato in Australia that I've had some dealings with. I know they have an Agile coaching department. So that's one model, but there's not a ton of opportunity there. And even there's a question of where do you go? Is that the top? Is that the top of the ladder? Right. The other way you can go is consulting. Yeah. And so you can go into a consultancy, and there are these big consultancies out there, and I know they have all different models, but they're typically helping with Agile adoptions or Agile tune-ups or whatever. I think both have value, especially if the consultancy is done right. It can be really great to kickstart something. It can be really great to refresh something with an outside view. On the other hand, the in-house Agile coach is going to have a much better chance of really getting into nuance and really building good behaviors over time. With either of those, the question is, then what? What's next? True. And I think once you broaden the notion of what you're doing as an Agile coach, right, to really looking at the whole environment, like over the last year, I spent time focusing on OKRs, or objectives and key results. That's been a huge push in the company. I've been focusing a lot on lean startup principles. I'm now focusing a lot on the idea of autonomy and working through, I don't know if you've heard of TEAL, this idea that's expressed in Reinventing Organizations, and pursuing some of the stuff there. So once you start thinking about more broadly, then the role starts to expand to things like, I guess broadly you would call it management consulting, but I'm doing it sort of in-house. And could lead anywhere, right? I mean, theoretically, you could then go on and run your own company. You could move into HR. You could go in a lot of different ways. The thing that's interesting is that any of those would represent leaving the Scrum Master Agile Coach career path and just jumping into another one.
Right.
Would not be, there doesn't seem to be like a, beyond Agile coaching. It's like you kind of go to consultancy or solo consultancy or you stay in-house. Those are your options. So,
is there anything that we have not touched upon that you have a view on that you think we need to share with the audio audience?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think that what's interesting about the Scrum Master role, one of the things that really interests me about the Scrum Master role is a lot of people will ask me about, like, how do you get into it?
Right.
How do you start? And what I think is interesting about it is that you can start with very, very little experience. You can be an effective Scrum Master in one day. Right? I was just talking to this guy. He is a college intern here, and he's a Scrum Master on one of the teams. And he said he was worried because he said, I'm a college intern, and I don't know, I can't tell people what to do. And I was like, well, because it's not about telling people what to do.
Yeah.
Said, if you're a human being, which means you have curiosity. I said, you can sit there in a meeting and you can be curious about something. It could be something as boring as this. You could say, this meeting seems really boring to me. Do you guys agree? Right? And you've already been extremely effective as a Scrum Master, right? Because you brought something to the surface that was not being said earlier. And so the thing is, he can't go get hired as a Scrum Master with that, but he can start practicing it on day one. And that's something that I find really interesting because you can get people practicing as Scrum Masters on teams. Like, even if you had an organization where you're like, well, we can't afford to put Scrum Masters everywhere.
Right.
Bring in one coach and you have them do what I'm doing, right? Meet with have a person on every team, and then you make sure that every person on every team has support to at least try this basic idea and ask these simple questions. And they can start getting better at other things. They can learn about test-driven development and about, retro techniques, and they can become better speakers and conflict navigation. They can do all that stuff over time. And then that can be something that develops. So it's an interesting role in that sense, that you can start with really no background, especially internally in a company. And so when people are on Quora, I think someone asked me, how do you get started? And I said, I can't remember, I wrote it a long time ago, but my answer was something along the lines of, just if someone will let you do it, just do it.
Yeah, just do it.
And just try and learn and get better. And then if you decide you want to move into that field, then you can go apply for a job because you've got the experience.
That's true.
But it's an interesting role in that way.
Great. No, this is such great conversation. And when we started this, we spoke about your acting and the role. And it ties so perfectly together.
It's funny. I do.
It does. Great, thank you so much for your time and great talking to you.
It was great talking.